The quiet of space was broken by a signal, one that came from the depths of the galaxy where few dared to travel. On a small, isolated planet at the edge of known space, a team of communications specialists worked in a station that seemed almost forgotten. The station was not large, but it was filled with advanced technology, screens flickering with endless streams of data, and antennas that stretched into the sky, catching waves invisible to the naked eye. The team was used to monitoring signals from nearby planets, tracking movements, and decoding messages that could mean peace or danger. Yet, on that day, something entirely unexpected appeared on their monitors, a transmission unlike any they had seen before. It was a message sent to all sentient beings across the galaxy, a call to come together, to cooperate, and to form connections that could shape the future. The message was careful, polite, and filled with hope. It spoke of alliances, of mutual understanding, of learning from each other and sharing knowledge. To the humans and other species monitoring it, the transmission felt like a promise, a chance to bridge the vast distances and differences between worlds. The team stared at the screens in awe. Some leaned closer, trying to pick up hidden meanings, while others simply sat back, amazed that such a clear and direct message had reached them. The words were simple, but the meaning was profound. It was rare in the galaxy for anyone to extend a hand so openly, especially when the history of space was filled with conflict, mistrust, and caution. To the monitors, this message was a beacon, a spark of hope in the lonely expanse of the stars. Yet, not all who received the call saw it as an opportunity. Far from the peaceful observatories and clean stations, on a planet known for its harsh climate and even harsher inhabitants, the message caused something entirely different. The Deathworlders, as they were called by those who had heard stories of them, did not respond with curiosity or hope. They reacted with suspicion. Life on their planet was never easy. It was shaped by storms, extreme temperatures, and terrain that could destroy the unprepared in minutes. Every decision, every movement, every thought had to be measured against survival. Outsiders, even friendly ones, were rarely welcomed without scrutiny. The leaders of the Deathworlders gathered in a high, jagged fortress that rose like a dark shadow over the planet's jagged mountains. Inside, the walls were carved from the black stone of the land itself, and the room was lit by faint, flickering lights that reflected off metal surfaces. Around a central table, the council convened to discuss the message. They read and reread it, but they did not see a call for peace. To them, it looked like a challenge, a test, a provocation. The very idea that someone from the wider galaxy might demand attention or expect cooperation felt insulting. In their minds, any invitation carried a hidden agenda, a trap waiting to be sprung on those who were not cautious enough. The council debated in low, serious tones. Some argued that the message should be ignored entirely. To engage could be dangerous. Others said that showing any form of interest could be interpreted as weakness. The strongest voices, those who had survived countless natural disasters and internal conflicts, insisted that the Deathworlders needed to respond, but on their own terms. Every word of the message was dissected, and each gesture of goodwill from the senders was viewed with skepticism. The idea that anyone could simply extend friendship across light years was almost laughable to them. Back at the communications station on the remote planet, the human team continued to analyze the message. They traced its origin, studied its pattern, and shared their findings with other nearby worlds. Some saw it as a chance for trade, others as an opportunity to exchange knowledge, and a few wondered if it could signal the start of a larger alliance. Excitement grew and a plan began to form. Envoys would be sent, representatives from multiple planets would meet, and discussions would start in a neutral location. To them, this was history in the making, but the Deathworlders were already preparing, though no one else knew it yet. They began sending scouts to observe the neighboring planets to see what kind of beings had sent the call, to measure the technology and the strategies of those who responded. Unlike other species who might have replied with curiosity or gratitude, the Deathworlders focused on assessment, studying weaknesses and strengths, thinking of contingencies and worst-case scenarios. They trained in silence, honing skills that were necessary for survival, unaware that their preparations were being misread as hostility by other species. The first scout returned with detailed reports. It spoke of beings who looked fragile, whose technology was advanced but sometimes untested in extreme conditions, and whose values seemed soft, almost naive. The Deathworlders saw this as confirmation that they were superior in both environment and strategy. The council nodded with grim satisfaction. If the call was meant to unite, it would not be on the terms of the senders. The Deathworlders would set the terms, and they would do so in a way that demanded respect, even if others did not yet understand it. Meanwhile, other planets and their leaders were making plans for the meeting. Ships were prepared, routes calculated, and schedules set. They did not know that a species like the Deathworlders interpreted messages in ways no one could predict. They did not realize that what was meant as a call to friendship could be taken as a provocation. The contrast between intention and perception began to grow, like two stars on a collision course, shining brightly but dangerously close. As the days passed, tension quietly built on both sides. The humans and other species felt excitement, optimism, and curiosity. They could not see the storm brewing on the Deathworlders' planet, the Council's growing determination to assert dominance, or the careful, calculated preparations being made. No one noticed that a simple message could spark fear, pride, and misunderstanding in ways no one intended. By the time the envoys were ready to depart, the Deathworlders had already decided how they would respond. Not with words, not with negotiation, but with a presence that could not be ignored. The galaxy was about to learn that while some species heard calls and invitations with joy, others heard only challenge and threat. And in the harsh, jagged world of the Deathworlders, survival and pride came first, no matter what messages arrived from distant stars. The envoys from the Coalition began their journey across the galaxy with careful planning and hope in their hearts. Ships glided silently through the darkness, engines humming softly as they passed star systems and asteroid fields. Each envoy represented a different planet, and each carried the knowledge, culture, and technology of their homeworlds. The idea was simple: meet peacefully, exchange ideas, and begin a dialogue that could last generations. Every member of the delegation believed in the mission. They had trained for months studying diplomacy, survival, and cultural differences. But even the most thorough preparation could not account for the Deathworlders. As the envoys approached the neutral meeting point, they were unaware that a pair of Deathworlder scouts had already arrived ahead of them. The scouts observed from hidden positions, noting every movement, every maneuver of the approaching ships. Their eyes, adapted to low light and extreme conditions, scanned for weaknesses. Their minds, shaped by generations of surviving harsh worlds, calculated every possible risk. The Coalition believed they were arriving in a safe zone, ready to engage with multiple species who shared their interest in collaboration. They had no idea that the Deathworlders were watching, judging, and preparing to respond on their own terms. When the envoys landed, they were greeted by representatives of several planets, all curious and eager. There was an air of excitement, mixed with caution. Negotiation tables were set up, and discussion chambers filled with soft lights and holographic displays. Envoys exchanged greetings, shared meals, and told stories of their homeworlds. Plans for collaboration, trade, and mutual protection were discussed. In many ways, it was everything the Coalition had hoped for. Yet the Deathworlders had not appeared. Their absence was not due to disinterest, but a deliberate choice to observe first. The scout returned to the Deathworlder Council with detailed reports. The envoy ships were slower than expected. Their technology was impressive, but not flawless. They had predictable patterns. Some delegates were brave, others cautious, and a few seemed untested in real challenges. The council listened carefully, nodding with approval. "They believe in peace," one of the elders said. "They are inexperienced in true danger. We must show them strength." The words were calm, but the meaning was clear. The Deathworlders did not see the meeting as an opportunity for exchange. They saw it as an arena, a place to demonstrate superiority. Meanwhile, the envoys continued their preparations. They set up communication channels, tested their equipment, and rehearsed their speeches. Many were unaware that the Deathworlders were analyzing them from afar. Every gesture, every word, every maneuver was noted and interpreted in the context of survival. The Deathworlders believed that hesitation or misstep could be exploited. They studied patterns, read expressions, and predicted strategies. What the Coalition considered minor details were, to the Deathworlders, potential vulnerabilities. Small incidents began to occur. A minor navigation error by one of the envoy ships led to a slight collision with a satellite near the neutral planet. No one was hurt and damage was minimal, but the Deathworlder scouts reported it as carelessness. To them, the Coalition seemed fragile, unprepared, and unaware of the risks that true survival demanded. Each envoy's polite apology was interpreted as weakness. Each act of kindness or friendliness was viewed with suspicion. The Council decided that the Deathworlders should begin preparing for a more visible response. Orders were given for advanced training exercises. Deathworlders moved through harsh terrains, adapting to extreme temperatures and obstacles. They simulated attacks and defenses, not for practice against their own people, but in anticipation of a challenge from outsiders. Every drill reinforced the belief that survival required strength, vigilance, and a readiness to act without hesitation. They practiced silently, efficiently, and without warning. To them, speed and decisiveness were as important as skill. The envoys, unaware of these exercises, continued their peaceful preparations. The Coalition organized smaller exploratory teams to interact with other species in the region. They met scientists, traders, and leaders who had responded to the call. These meetings were calm, informative, and cooperative. The envoys believed that by sharing knowledge and technology, trust would grow naturally. They did not yet understand that the Deathworlders saw such gestures as attempts to manipulate and control. To the Deathworlders, generosity could mask. Weakness and cooperation could hide intentions that were dangerous. As time passed, tension slowly built. Envoys noticed subtle signs, reports of unusual movements, traces of monitoring devices, and strange signals intercepted on communication networks. Some began to sense that they were not entirely alone, that a powerful presence watched them silently. Others dismissed it as precaution, assuming it was normal in a galaxy where trust was rare. But the Deathworlders were careful. They did not reveal themselves openly yet. Their strategy was observation and preparation. They would respond, but only when the timing was right. The envoys' leaders held meetings to discuss their strategy. They wanted to appear welcoming and strong, to show that cooperation could bring benefits to all. They considered messages of goodwill, gifts of technology, and even demonstrations of shared history and culture. They were optimistic, believing that most species would respond with curiosity and interest. None of them anticipated that the Deathworlders would see every gesture as a test, every approach as a challenge to their pride. Meanwhile, on the Deathworlder homeworld, the Council finalized plans. They chose representatives to approach the envoys not as equals but as a force that demanded recognition. The Deathworlders had no intention of engaging in simple diplomacy. Their approach was measured, deliberate, and intimidating by design. They wanted to ensure that any interaction would leave no doubt about their strength and independence. The galaxy was full of naive beings, untested and unprepared, and it was their responsibility to show what true survival required. By the time the envoys were ready to meet representatives from every planet, including the Deathworlders, the stage was set. The Coalition believed in dialogue and mutual respect, while the Deathworlders prepared to assert dominance. Each side believed in its own truth, its own interpretation of the call to action. The galaxy had never seen a situation like this, where hope and caution, optimism and survival instinct clashed so closely. What was meant to be a historic meeting of minds and hearts was now poised to become a lesson in understanding, misperception, and the vast differences between species shaped by entirely different worlds. The envoys did not know it yet, but the first impression of the Deathworlders would define the relationship for years to come. Every word, every gesture, every decision mattered, and the Deathworlders, silent and watchful, were ready to take the call personally, in ways no one else had imagined. Tensions quietly grew as the envoys prepared for the first official meetings with all the responding species. The neutral planet, chosen for its safety and central location, buzzed with activity. Shuttles arrived from distant star systems, carrying delegates, scientists, and observers. Holographic screens displayed schedules, maps, and notes from each participating world. Everyone was eager to begin, believing in the possibility of collaboration. Yet beneath the excitement, an unseen tension lingered. The Deathworlders had already made their calculations, and they were watching every move. The first interactions were carefully planned. Delegates exchanged greetings, shook hands, and offered small gifts representing their homeworlds. Stories were shared about distant landscapes, cultures, and achievements. The envoys led discussions about trade, resource sharing, and scientific discovery. Many species responded with curiosity, asking questions, and offering ideas. The atmosphere seemed hopeful, even inspiring. However, the Deathworlder scouts, hidden from view, interpreted the scene very differently. Every gesture of friendliness, every polite phrase, and every exchange of gifts was analyzed. To the Deathworlders, the actions seemed unnecessary and exaggerated, almost like an attempt to hide weakness behind courtesy. They observed closely, taking note of potential vulnerabilities. The Deathworlders' understanding of communication was different from most species. While others saw kindness as trust, the Deathworlders saw it as an opportunity to gain an advantage. They believed that survival depended on reading not only actions but intentions, and nothing should be taken at face value. Small incidents began to amplify the tension. During a demonstration of interstellar technology, one of the envoy ships' engines malfunctioned, causing a brief but visible disturbance. No one was hurt, and the engineers quickly corrected the issue. To the participating species, it was a minor technical hiccup. To the Deathworlders, however, it confirmed their suspicions. They believed the coalition was fragile, unprepared for real challenges, and vulnerable to mistakes. Pride and instinct combined to create a sense of urgency. The Deathworlders decided that passive observation was no longer enough. Meanwhile, the envoys continued their careful attempts to include everyone. They set up meetings, assigned teams, to discuss shared goals, and ensured that all participants had a voice. They did not yet know that the Deathworlders were preparing for a different kind of engagement, one where strength and decisiveness mattered more than words or gestures. The Deathworlders' leaders instructed their scouts to relay updates, while teams trained for quick strategic responses. Every movement was measured, every strategy tested in simulations of confrontation. Despite the growing danger, the envoys remained optimistic. They believed that patience, transparency, and sincerity could bridge even the widest cultural gaps. They were determined to prevent misunderstandings from turning into conflict. Stories of previous peaceful exchanges between other species gave them hope, and they thought that any cautious behavior from the Deathworlders could be guided by diplomacy. What they did not anticipate was how differently survival instincts shaped perception. The Deathworlders saw delay as hesitation, caution as fear, and openness as vulnerability. The first misunderstanding occurred during a simple negotiation exercise. Delegates from two species began discussing the sharing of rare minerals, using charts and numbers to illustrate possibilities. The Deathworlder scouts interpreted the discussion as a negotiation for dominance. The detailed charts and polite debates were taken as evidence that the other species were trying to control resources unfairly. Reports were sent back to the Deathworlder Council, and urgent instructions were given. The Deathworlders would prepare to assert themselves physically if necessary. To them, showing restraint was dangerous. Any hesitation could be exploited. Preparations on the Deathworlder side intensified. Training grounds were filled with simulations of skirmishes, rapid responses, and tactical exercises. Teams moved silently across harsh terrains, simulating night attacks and ambushes. Every movement reinforced their belief in readiness, efficiency, and decisive action. They did not intend to attack immediately, but they wanted to ensure that Any misstep by outsiders could be countered without hesitation. Survival had always been the core of their culture, and their instinct was to act first and think later when threatened. Back on the neutral planet, the envoys held workshops designed to foster trust. They shared stories of hardship and success, of cooperation that had saved lives on distant worlds. They believed that understanding and empathy could prevent conflict. Some delegates noticed subtle hints that something was off. Unexplained interference in communications, strange signals, and unaccounted for movements near observation posts. A few began to worry, but most believed it was simple technical issues or natural anomalies. They could not imagine the silent and calculating presence of the Deathworlders watching them. The first skirmish, though small, became the turning point. A coalition survey team accidentally entered an area that the Deathworlders considered their territory, unaware of its importance. There was no intent to trespass. It was a simple mapping exercise. Yet the Deathworlders interpreted it as a deliberate act of provocation. They moved quickly, surrounding the survey team with trained units. The encounter was brief, no lives were lost, but the message was clear. The Deathworlders did not tolerate intrusion. Reports sent back to the Council emphasized that the coalition underestimated the seriousness of their approach. The envoys were shocked when they learned of the skirmish. Confusion spread as they tried to understand what had happened and why. Messages of apology were sent, but the Deathworlders did not respond. With words, they responded with calculated presence and readiness. Every subsequent attempt to engage diplomatically was met with the same perception of threat. The envoys began to realize that this was unlike any other negotiation they had experienced. They were dealing with a species whose instincts, culture, and priorities were profoundly different. As the situation escalated, both sides began to prepare for what might come next. The coalition increased security, studied the behavior of the Deathworlders, and reassessed strategies for negotiation. They remained committed to peace, but the possibility of conflict was no longer theoretical. The Deathworlders, in turn, continued to train, plan, and observe. Their response would not be reckless, but it would be firm, decisive, and designed to demonstrate that they were a force to be reckoned with. By the end of the part, the galaxy had reached a critical point. What started as a hopeful invitation for dialogue had shifted into a complex web of perception, instinct, and misunderstanding. Every move mattered, and every decision carried weight. The envoys still believed in diplomacy and collaboration, but the Deathworlders' unique perspective ensured that the next encounter would test every assumption, patience, and skill. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true nature of both sides, and no one could predict the full outcome. The first signs of real conflict began quietly, almost imperceptibly. On the barren border planet chosen for strategic observation, small skirmishes broke out as misunderstandings became harder to control. The envoys had hoped that careful planning, diplomacy, and goodwill could prevent escalation, but the Deathworlders operated by different rules. To them, hesitation was dangerous, and perceived weakness invited challenge. The first confrontation was sudden, brief, but unforgettable, and it set the tone for what would follow. The incident began when a coalition reconnaissance team, moving cautiously near a resource-rich area, inadvertently triggered a Deathworlder sensor. The sensor detected movement and the Deathworlders responded immediately. Units trained for extreme conditions moved across rocky terrain with precision and speed. Their approach was silent, calculated, and efficient. By the time the coalition team realized they were being watched, the Deathworlders had already taken strategic positions blocking potential escape routes. Though the envoys had superior technology in their ships and communication, the Deathworlders' intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage. The first clash was tense but controlled. No one intended to inflict permanent harm, yet every maneuver sent a message. The Deathworlders wanted to show strength, to establish that their pride, skill, and vigilance could not be underestimated. The coalition forces were surprised at the adaptability of the Deathworlders. They moved with an almost instinctive understanding of the terrain, anticipating every action. The envoys tried to respond with diplomacy, broadcasting messages of peace and apologies for the intrusion, but the Deathworlders remained focused on demonstrating readiness and capability. As the day progressed, small skirmishes escalated into larger confrontations. Coalition leaders tried to coordinate their forces, using long-range communications to organize retreats and reposition teams. The Deathworlders, however, had already anticipated these strategies. They split their units using flanking techniques and quick maneuvers to isolate small groups. Every encounter was a lesson in survival, strategy, and endurance. Soldiers on both sides realized that this was not a battle of weapons alone, but a test of resilience, intelligence, and quick thinking. Amid the chaos, stories of individual bravery emerged. A young envoy officer risked exposure to help a stranded colleague, navigating dangerous terrain under pressure. A Deathworlder scout used ingenuity to protect a group of civilians inadvertently caught in the crossfire. Observers on both sides began to notice that even in conflict there was intelligence, strategy, and unexpected honor. The first real lesson of the confrontation was clear. While the Deathworlders were fierce and relentless, they were also disciplined and capable of restraint when necessary. The coalition forces quickly realized that their technology alone could not guarantee victory. Their weapons and ships, while advanced, were less effective in the unpredictable terrain of the border planet. The Deathworlders' training, adaptability, and environmental awareness allowed them to anticipate moves, set ambushes, and control engagements. Coalition leaders began revising strategies, focusing on cooperation between different species to counterbalance the Deathworlders' advantages. Yet even with careful coordination, every step forward required vigilance. The psychological toll on both sides was significant. Envoys and soldiers faced the stress of constant observation and threat, knowing that a single mistake could be catastrophic. The Deathworlders, trained for extreme conditions, were also challenged by the unfamiliar technology and unpredictable behaviors of the coalition. Every engagement, even when no one was seriously harmed, heightened awareness, sharpened instincts, and created tension. The standoff was not merely physical, it was mental, emotional, and strategic. As the confrontation continued, both sides began to see the other in a new light. Coalition leaders realized that the Deathworlders were not mindless aggressors. Their tactics were precise, their decisions rooted in survival instincts and experience on a harsh homeworld. Similarly, the Deathworlders recognized that the coalition forces were persistent, adaptable, and willing to act with intelligence and caution. Respect grew, even amid conflict, though it did not prevent continued clashes. Attempts at communication persisted. Envoys broadcast messages offering negotiations, promising peaceful coexistence and collaboration. The Deathworlders, however, interpreted these gestures cautiously. To them, words were not proof of intent, actions mattered far more. They watched closely, responding to perceived weaknesses, but also learning from the coalition's strategies. Every movement became a test, every engagement an opportunity to refine tactics and understand the opposing mindset. By the third day of the confrontation, it became clear that neither side would back down easily. The coalition had the advantage of technology, resources, and numbers, but the Deathworlders had mastery of terrain, adaptability, and sheer determination. Both sides began to realize that victory would not come through force alone. Respect, understanding, and careful decision-making were equally critical. Leaders on both sides started to observe patterns, predict behavior, and adjust strategies accordingly. The first major turning point occurred when a coalition unit, cornered on rocky cliffs, used quick thinking and precise coordination to escape an ambush. The Deathworlders, though frustrated, recognized the ingenuity and courage of their opponents. The encounter was brief, but it marked a shift in perception. Both sides understood that future confrontations would not merely test strength, but intelligence, strategy, and judgment. The clash was no longer simply about asserting dominance. It was a complex game of survival and adaptation. By the end of the part, the first true conflict had taught valuable lessons. The Deathworlders demonstrated that their reputation for toughness and adaptability was well earned. The coalition forces, learned that diplomacy alone could not prevent misunderstandings and that technology had limits against instinct and experience. Observers from other species documented every detail, realizing that this confrontation would serve as a lesson for generations to come. The stage was now set for the final part, where both sides would confront the reality of their differences, the consequences of misunderstanding, and the necessity of mutual respect. The galaxy had witnessed the first clash of wills, strength, and strategy, and no one could predict how the lessons learned would shape the future. Both sides knew that survival, pride, and perception would determine the next moves, and the outcome would depend not only on power but on wisdom, restraint, and insight. After days of tense encounters and carefully measured conflict, both sides began to recognize the heavy cost of misunderstanding. The coalition forces, exhausted but determined, realized that technology and numbers alone could not ensure dominance. Every maneuver, every strategy, and every decision had required careful thought, and yet the Deathworlders had constantly challenged assumptions, forcing adaptability at every turn. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders, proud and unyielding, recognized the determination and intelligence of their opponents. They had entered the conflict expecting weakness, but instead found resilience, courage, and strategic thinking. The first signs of a truce were subtle. A coalition envoy, observing the patterns of the Deathworlders, suggested a cautious approach, small gestures of cooperation without compromising security. They proposed shared observation points where both sides could monitor the land and resources without feeling threatened. The Deathworlders, initially skeptical, agreed to limited participation. It was not an act of friendship, but a recognition that continued confrontation would drain resources and risk unnecessary loss. Both sides understood that survival, not pride, must guide the next steps. With this cautious agreement, small teams from both sides began to work together. Engineers, strategists, and observers collaborated on tasks such as mapping the terrain, studying environmental hazards, and managing supplies. These joint efforts were tense at first. Every instruction was scrutinized, every movement watched. Yet slowly a rhythm emerged. Mutual respect began to take shape not as friendship, but as acknowledgement of each other's skill, intelligence, and commitment. The coalition realized that the Deathworlders were not merely aggressive, they were disciplined, capable, and principled in their own way. One memorable incident reinforced this understanding. A sudden storm swept across the neutral planet, threatening both coalition teams and Deathworlder units. In a display of coordination, both sides worked to protect equipment, assist injured personnel, and secure their positions. It was the first time they acted together without suspicion of hidden motives. The experience demonstrated that despite differences in perspective and culture, collaboration was possible when survival and shared goals aligned. Both sides gained a glimpse of what cooperation could look like, even if it was temporary and cautious. Meanwhile, observers from other species documented every interaction. They noted the lessons being learned in real time: patience, strategy, communication, and perception. The galaxy had rarely seen such a combination of conflict and collaboration. The envoys began to compile reports for their homeworlds, highlighting the importance of understanding other species' instincts and values. They realized that every gesture, every word, and every observation mattered far more than anticipated. Misunderstandings could escalate quickly, but recognition of skill and intent could prevent catastrophe. The Deathworlder Council continued to monitor these developments closely. They were pragmatic, not sentimental. While they allowed joint efforts, they remained alert and ready to respond to any perceived threat. The truce was not an end to vigilance but a strategic pause. They understood that power, perception, and preparation were all essential in interactions with other species. At the same time, they began to respect the coalition's resilience. Persistence, careful planning, and intelligence were qualities the Deathworlders valued, even if they would never fully trust outsiders. By the following weeks, patterns of cautious interaction became the norm. Both sides learned to anticipate actions, interpret intentions, and make decisions based on more than first impressions. Training exercises now included cooperative problem-solving scenarios, tests of endurance, and simulated emergencies. The coalition gained an understanding of the Deathworlders' perspective, realizing that survival in extreme conditions shaped priorities differently from those on calmer worlds. The Deathworlders, in turn, gained insight into the discipline, ingenuity, and dedication of other species. The experience left a lasting impression on the envoys. They had entered the encounter hoping for dialogue and cooperation, and while the results were not what they had imagined, they had learned invaluable lessons. The galaxy had not yet achieved full unity, but it had witnessed the possibility of understanding across profound differences. The envoys recognized that respect, observation, and careful communication were as vital as technology or numbers in interactions with unknown species. The Deathworlders returned to their home planet with a clear sense of accomplishment. They had demonstrated strength, discipline, and resilience, and they had learned that not every species would exploit weakness. They did not consider themselves friends of the coalition, nor did they fully trust any outsider. But they recognized that caution, respect, and observation could prevent unnecessary conflict. Their pride remained intact yet tempered by experience. They had taken the call personally, responding with force when necessary, but also learning the value of measured engagement. For the coalition, the encounter became a case study in diplomacy, strategy, and perception. Reports highlighted the importance of understanding different instincts, environmental pressures, and cultural values. Envoys reflected on the unpredictability of the Deathworlders, realizing that gestures of peace could be interpreted in ways they had not imagined. They came to understand that invitations to cooperation were never simple, and that successful interaction required patience, observation, and adaptability. As the final stage of the story unfolded, both sides left the neutral planet with a deeper awareness of each other. The Deathworlders had not been conquered or persuaded. The coalition had not been defeated. Instead, both sides had gained insight, understanding, and a cautious respect. The galaxy itself had learned that not all invitations would be received as intended. Some species would respond with curiosity, others with caution, and some, like the Deathworlders, would take the call personally, guided by instincts honed over generations. In the aftermath, peace was fragile but achievable. Communication channels remained open, though carefully monitored. Joint observation programs continued, and occasional exchanges of knowledge took place under strict guidelines. Stories of bravery, intelligence, and unexpected collaboration circulated among the participating species. The encounter became a lesson in humility, strategy, and the complexity of interstellar diplomacy. Ultimately, the galaxy learned that strength and perception were equally important. The Deathworlders remained a force to be reckoned with, and the coalition gained wisdom that no amount of technology or planning could provide. Both sides had discovered that understanding and respect, even in small doses, could prevent misunderstandings from becoming disasters. And in that understanding, the first seeds of a new era of cautious cooperation were planted. A fragile, tentative promise for the future, shaped not by simple words, but by actions, resilience, and the lessons learned in the harshest of circumstances. The story closed not with victory or defeat, but with a recognition of limits, possibilities, and the complexity of life across the stars. The galaxy had witnessed the first true meeting of survival instincts and interstellar diplomacy. And though the Deathworlders returned to their harsh homeworld, the experience remained a lasting reminder that the universe was full of species, shaped by extremes, and that every call to action must be measured not only in words but in understanding the minds and instincts of those who might answer it.